Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hola. Bonjour.
Thank you for joining us. Hello, everyone. You notice that Tom is not with us today. He'll have to stay away for a few weeks, but of course he will be back. And thank you for joining today's part 3 of the Human-Animal Divide series with Laura Schleifer. Laura is co-founder and organizer at the Plant the Land Team Gaza, and she is also Total Liberation Campaign director at the Institute of Critical Animal Studies, North America. During the previous 2 shows, we explored the construct of the animal-human divide and how this was used to oppress other humans. And this week, we'll explore what happened when Darwin challenged this human-animal binary with his theory of evolution, and furthermore, what happens in general when those in power embrace their animality and use this as an excuse to further oppress other humans. So, I think, Wendy, I think you want to say some hellos before we go into that?
Definitely. I'll become the hello person now. I love it.
I'll be the goodbye person.
You'll be the goodbye person. So who we got here? We have Vegmet Codbod. I love saying that name. We've got Jennifer, who is early today. Thanks, Jennifer, for being early. Hi, Deb. Hi, Amber. Hi there, Rama and Tori and Bernie and Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. Good to see you here. And Hope. Oh, hi, Hope. I don't think Hope's been here before. Maybe they have. But hello and welcome. Just say hello, anyone. Oh, hi, Ronnie. Just joined in. Say hi in the comments if you're here, and we'll try and get through your comments as well. So do interact with Laura's presentation, because she'll take your comments, and we'd really appreciate your interaction and your perspectives on everything that Laura's going to talk about. So, and hi there, Bernie V and Reluctant Warrior, who just joined as well.
That's an interesting
welcome, one and all.
Title, isn't it? Look, Reluctant Warrior. So have to be dragged to war or something.
Probably rather not be having a war kind of thing, but hey, we're
here, so imagine that. Right, should I get this this machine up? Should I?
Yes,
machine.
Please do.
I like how Reluctant Warrior said, may as well watch. What else are you going to do on a Monday night, Reluctant Warrior? I don't know. You might as well.
You can listen as well. You can listen as well.
Listen.
Yeah. Multitasking. Right. So, Laura, welcome back, and take it away. So we're this is Laura part 3, and then we're expecting you to return in about a month's time. To bring us right bang up to date, the 21st century and all that kind of modern stuff.
Yes, and the final conclusion to this very long saga of...
I'm going to say final solution, given what we're going to go.
No, that will be coming up in this episode.
Yeah.
Yes, so... the human-animal divide when those in power embrace their own animality. Okay, so this is something that I really am approaching with a lot of excitement but trepidation. It's very important that the animal rights movement becomes aware of the other side of this issue, because generally speaking, what I found is that we tend to hear a lot about how animalization has been weaponized against marginalized people. We tend to hear that those in power kind of retained their human identity, or they perceive themselves as humans as opposed to other people not being quite human or being more animalized. And because of that, we very often kind of hear this lopsided side of the story, where we're not hearing about the other side of when the privileged and powerful class actually embraced their own animality and saw it as part of their supremacy. So we're going to take a look at that today. And we're going to be looking at the advent of social Darwinism in the aftermath of Darwin's explosive revelations. We're going to be talking about eugenics, and we are actually going to be talking about the dreaded subject of Nazism and its connections to animal welfare, and vegetarianism, and all that really controversial stuff that comes up sporadically in relation to Nazism that nobody wants to talk about, but we need to.
And Laurie, you're going to do that in 55 minutes, right?
I'm going to try and run through all this in 55 minutes. Yes.
Well,
So,
good luck.
A lot of human history to go through here. So we're going to run back to the Enlightenment for a minute. And I want to just take a look at the aesthetics of the Enlightenment as opposed to the period that comes directly after it, which is the Romantic Era. And actually, I'm going to ask our panel or our guests, do you notice anything about how you would describe the aesthetics of the Enlightenment? Looking at these two pictures of fashion, and also the other one is of kind of reflective of their attitudes towards nature. That's a typical, well, not typical, it's a ruling class, but Enlightenment garden.
Yeah, what I would get from that would be this kind of thing that Jim Mason talks about in Unnatural Order, which is, that idea that when people from Europe arrived in North America, they declared it empty of humans because nature had not been tamed and ordered and all that. And so is that what you're getting at there?
That's definitely a big part of it. Yeah, there's this attitude that part of what makes you human is your ability to dominate the landscape. And so you see that very, very clear visual representation of domination. The fashion also, I think, is very significant because you'll notice that they were wearing wigs. You'll notice that they powdered their faces. They wore corsets. They wore, all this very elaborate frippery. And that also is a very big reflection of their attitudes about nature and animals, because the more artificial the costuming, the more distanced from animals and therefore animality and nature. Now, again, during this era, this is when they realized that other animals, and specifically vertebrates, have a nervous system, have a brain, very similar to humans. So there was actually a lot of insecurity in the Europeans at that time of realizing that. And they, I would say, projected that insecurity onto the people that they colonized. Oh, you're the ones who are the animals. You're the ones who are like non-human animals. We, on the other hand, are Europeans. We are humans, quote unquote. So let's take a look now at the image that comes after that one.
Okay. I don't know if anybody's the same as me, but I just want to pick that person up and go ding, 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 ding.
I would stick them on my toilet roll, quite frankly.
Yeah, you didn't think that was going to be part of the Animal Rights show, did you, today? I'm going to stick it on my toilet roll.
Do you remember those things, though, people used to have over their toilet rolls?
What they called the doily? Doily, wasn't it? Doily?
Was it something? Oh, doily. I thought they were more like crocheted thing. But yeah, you might be right. I can't remember. I know they were like dolls with big dresses.
So now we're looking at the Romantic Era. And this is the one that comes immediately after the Enlightenment. So we're talking about like the mid-19th century, sandwiched between the Enlightenment and the Victorian era in Europe, and specifically Britain, but also some other parts of Europe, including very significantly Germany, Russia. There were several areas that had a Romantic era. But let's take a look at the aesthetics here now. You see the change in fashion, and also, of course, the garden. And you can see it's a much more, I don't know, I'm going to ask you, what would you say about this image?
much more romantic. Laura,
Yeah, very
Much more romantic.
romantic and ethereal.
Anything that reflects their attitudes about nature and animals in this era, would you say, as opposed to the other era?
It's almost like nature does its own thing, but in a still controlled way, isn't it?
Still a little bit of control underneath, yeah. But definitely, and that's why it's romantic, because it's romanticizing nature and it's romanticizing all of these things, including in some ways, even, you know, this is where you get the era of the, I hate this term, but like the noble savage, right? Romanticizing native peoples, romanticizing, more relaxed. But yes, it's not a true representation or appreciation for. It's a romanticized, idealized version of. But that's very significant because you can see that there's some resistance coming into this very over-the-top artificiality of the Enlightenment and a nostalgia, which is a very big part of what this era was about. Nostalgia for the past. Industrialization is happening. And as it's rapidly happening, people are becoming more and more Europeans, becoming more and more nostalgic for what they had before, this agrarian sort of natural lifestyle.
Laura, there's a question in the comments from Tori saying they're curious if there's a source talking further about the clothing aesthetic specifically.
That's a really good question. I do not know offhand. This is actually just something I was thinking about as I was doing the research for this, but I'm going to look that up and definitely see if I can post that.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. So we'll continue.
And while we're waiting, by the way, Girly O says that they're really enjoying this series, Laura, and thanks so much for all the efforts.
Thank you so much.
Listening while they work.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we come to the Victorian era. That is an era where you had actually these two elements kind of both very active. On the one hand, you had the Enlightenment ideology quite active during this period, especially because it was the Industrial Revolution. So things were getting more and more mechanized, instrumentalized. This all harkens back to these Enlightenment ideas of progress and modernization and all of this. And then on the other hand, you have the Romantic attitude, which is kind of adverse to all of that and really wanting to go back to this more natural past, although again, an idealized sort of version of that. And into this kind of volatile mix to begin with, in waltzes Darwin with his theory of evolution and also the whole idea of natural selection. And of course, this idea that all humans, regardless of race, regardless of class, regardless of anything else, that we all are primates who evolved from a primate ancestor. This did not go over very well, as you can probably imagine, with the upper class Europeans especially.
Well, the thing about that, right, is that it's probably hard for us to probably register how much of a shock that must have been, right?
No kidding.
Yeah.
And, would you say that although religion is not that powerful at this point, the church still is its ruling class? So he faces huge pushback from them.
Yeah. Now, the church, of course, is completely terrified of this because, and actually, I have to say that after having done all of this research, I understand better why the church is so terrified of this. Because when you undo this underpinning of our understanding of the world, it rips everything apart. And that really has a lot to do with why I became so drawn to this subject matter and bringing it to the animal rights movement, is because actually, once you understand, all hell broke loose with the origin of the species. Commenter says, yes. And that's the thing, is that once you understand the power of what this means of animality and humans as animals and how that relates to our role in nature and the animal kingdom, it is a very, very powerful force. Now, it could go in the most liberatory direction or it could go in the most terrifying direction, but it's an extremely powerful idea, and that's why the church is afraid of it. So, yeah, during the Victorian era, Darwin waltzes in and he presents this information, and yes, mass freak out. They don't not handle this information well. And you can see in this drawing, this is the cartoonist saying, well, Darwin, maybe you descended from a primate, but that doesn't mean that the rest of us did. So speak for yourself, honey. So yeah, we can move ahead.
When I was doing my PhD, I found myself in the University of Wales library looking at all the research about the different versions of the Bible, and I think it was about that time when some of the Bibles, they changed "thou shalt not kill" to "thou shalt not murder" as the commandment. And again, I think it was to reestablish the divide. Yeah,
right. Human supremacy. Yeah, exactly. That's interesting because yeah, murder has such a more specific definition to who the victim is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So what ends up happening is that after this initial freak out, then certain members of the ruling class start to have ideas about how Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection could actually benefit their aims. So this has to do, of course, with this idea of, first of all, well, we're going to take a look at Herbert Spencer first. So he's the one on the left. And now he was actually a social theorist who already, you could say, had these ideas. But what he did was he kind of mapped those ideas onto Darwin's theories. And his ideas actually came originally from Adam Smith and the theories behind capitalism. But when he found out about Darwin's theories, he actually realized that he could rationalize capitalism through conceptions of nature and conceptions of animals and animal nature, and therefore humans as animals. So he was very attracted to the parts of Darwin's work that kind of emphasize this idea of competition in nature. He's the one who actually came up with the term survival of the fittest. He really emphasized, as they say, Darwin's parts about, nature red in tooth and claw, that it was this constant struggle for survival and that there were limited resources. He actually brought in also another theorist, Thomas Malthus, from the 18th century, who had a lot of theories about scarcity in ecological resources. And so he kind of created this image of humanity as being in this constant struggle for survival, that was, of course, the way that we were meant to be, because that's how it was in the natural world. And he really cherry-picked Darwin's research, because Darwin did have those pieces, but he also had pieces that showed animals cooperating and sharing and all this sort of thing. But he kind of, pushed all that away because it didn't fit his narrative, and he emphasized the parts about competition and scarcity. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you talk to any person on the street and you say, well, what is human nature? Chances, again, in the Western society, chances are very, very high that their conception of human nature is going to sound a lot like Spencer's conception of nature, which is social Darwinist. And that is because that's the narrative that they've been fed. So this is still a very dominant ideology in our population in this part of the world. And very often they will think that civilization kind of maybe curtails that to a certain extent, but that is really what's going on underneath. That's the true human nature.
Laura, it's funny actually you say that. It still plays out. Like you hear that all the time on the street when you're doing advocacy. I mean, how many times have we all heard that kind of cliched objection about lions? Because it's interesting how people immediately jump to the law of the jungle or dog eat dog. It's like, well, animals have to do it. Nature is mean. It's the way it is. We other animals kill. We have to kill. It's just the way it is. It's natural. Right. And of course, cherry picking when to embrace their animality and when to
Right.
distance themselves from it, as we've seen from the first two episodes of this presentation.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole thing is that is not a coincidence, that that's the narrative that people have been fed. Here we are 100 years later, 150 years later, and we're still being fed this narrative because we live in a capitalist society, and this is the narrative that suits capitalism, to make us think that capitalism is natural and normal and just the way it's meant to be. So
and also, would you say? I think you mentioned extensively that at the Kropotkin series. Would you
Right.
say that the role of mutual aid in nature was even more important for the evolution of species, but still it is downplayed?
Absolutely, yes. And that's something that I'm going to be exploring more in the final episode of this series. But yes, that's the whole thing, is that he really emphasized the things that were minimized in nature. Because for the most part, animals cooperate and share and all the rest of it. And, he kind of lopsided that. It's similar to how, a lot of times in the vegan movement, we'll talk about how we always hear about hunter-gatherers, and the hunting part is always emphasized, and the gathering part is downplayed, whereas in reality, was mostly gathering. Now they're even calling it foraging, and the hunting was minimized. But because there was a motive of a certain narrative that they wanted us all to internalize, this is the way that they present it.
And that fits in with patriarchy as well, doesn't it? The hunter being the man, the superior, the gathering being the woman, the inferior part of that duality. So therefore, hunter is emphasized and made superior in that binary. So again,
a few feminist inspired sociologists started saying forager hunter.
Right.
Gatherer hunter, and then, as Laura said, forager became the way that it was talked about then.
Yeah, I would say that actually ecofeminists were some of the first, again, I'm talking about in Western society, but they were some of the first in that context to break through that and to say, wait a minute here, you're presenting a very lopsided version of the way things really are, and you have a motive for doing that. Okay, we have a comment. Agreed. When we cut through the speciesism, I think people are ripening up to murder. I spoke with a non-vegan last night who called them it, but also referred to them being murdered. Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. So now we're going to take a look at the other man on the right. If you can call these people men, they're well, I guess they are. That's the sad thing. But so we have Francis Galton. Francis Galton was actually the half nephew of Darwin himself. And now I should mention, Darwin came from a very, very upper crust British family and had all the privilege and power in the world. And so Galton was coming from that perspective. Darwin himself was coming from that perspective. But Darwin was, we'll say, maybe a little bit more on the liberal end of that, whereas Galton, as you will see, was not. Galton looked at Darwin's theories, and he was very interested in this aspect of natural selection playing a role in evolution. And of course, this has to do with social Darwinism as well, because the idea was that certain animals had traits that gave them an advantage over other animals. And because of that, they were the ones who survived. And then because they were the ones who survived, they passed those traits down to their offspring. And then the offspring, of course, then passed that trait again. And over generations, that became the trait of the species. And that helped the species survive on the whole. So he gave the example of giraffes. This was Darwin giving that example. The ones with the longer necks had a better chance of surviving because they could reach the leaves on the trees. And therefore, over time, giraffes developed these enormous long necks because that was advantageous for their species. Well, when Darwin said, this is what happens in nature to other animals, and we are a species of animal, Galton said, well, if this is what other animals do and it helps their species survive, then what can we do to help our species have the advantage? Now, Galton, again, was coming from this sort of era where not everybody who is a human was being perceived as a human. And so when he thought of that, of course, in racialized terms. And he thought, well, what can we do to benefit the white European, quote unquote, species and give them the advantage? So he thought to himself, well, we are able to control breeding in other animals for traits that we want. We've been doing it for thousands of years with livestock, quote unquote, animals. If we can do this to livestock animals, and if we can do this to companion animals, why can't we do this to human animals? We can control the breeding, we can promote the traits we want, and we can get rid of the traits we don't want. And that is where a new movement was born. So we'll move to the next page. And that movement was called the eugenics movement. So he had an idea of how they could use the idea of their own animality to denote genetic superiority and redefine also conceptions of human nature. So social Darwinism, of course, was re-engineering the conception of human nature, modeling it on this distorted idea of animal nature and nature more generally. And eugenics, on the other hand, was thinking about actually changing that in physical terms. So this is actually the poster of the eugenics movement. It's a propaganda poster. And you can see it says, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. So in other words, we're not going to wait around for whatever natural force usually does it. We're going to take control of our own evolution ourselves.
Laura, there is a question from Rama. I don't know if we can say, it's a very interesting one. If you could answer that.
627, Roger, yeah.
Oh, but selective breeding was happening in enslaved populations before this, correct? Yes, because, again, there was this idea of they're more like animals, right? So there was this attitude of we do this to non-human animals and they're more like animals. So you can do that to them. But this was, oh, we're all animals, which means that we can actually get an advantage for our group through selectively breeding ourselves as well. And selectively breeding members of our group that have the traits that we want to propagate.
Do you want me to move on?
Laura,
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
I was going to ask with this actually, because I'm always trying to relate this back to sort of what's going on today. And I was just sort of thinking about when we're talking to non-vegans about other animals and we're trying to advocate for them, I feel, and I don't know what you feel about this, but I sometimes feel that it's problematic to highlight things like cognitive abilities in our fellow animals because we're kind of relating that to their moral value. For example, one thing that you hear a lot that is put a lot in memes or even spoken about on the street and things like that is that, people say, well, a pig has the same cognitive ability as a 4-year-old child, and that's something. And I can understand why people are doing that because they're trying to draw parallels between other animals and humans to try and kind of awake that empathy and compassion in people. But to me, I feel that this firstly implies that other animals of that species are all, a homogenous group. And therefore that takes away that individuality that we're trying to really highlight. And also I think these comparisons reinforce speciesism and ableism, which of course is very problematic and probably counterproductive in a movement that's all about anti-oppression. What would you agree on that? Would you say that's...
I agree 100% with that. Absolutely. And I would also add anthropocentrism, because there's this idea of everything has to be measured against the human. And again, how's the human defined in these very oppressive, I would say, again, Eurocentric terms, of course, ableist terms, et cetera, et cetera. And then every other species has to be matched against this one standard and then seen as coming up lacking. Well, how would we compare to 4-year-old pig's intelligence in the areas that they have intelligence and that we don't? Maybe we would come out to be and a baby pig because we hadn't advanced in their areas. So it's very, very much, again, the same way of thinking that undergirding all of it is really this idea of hierarchy and centering one group as the norm, and everybody else comes up short against that. So yeah, it's definitely problematic in all sorts of ways. And it's a good example of what happens when you kind of try to undo oppression in isolation. One form of oppression, I should say. So so going back to social Darwinism, under social Darwinism, morality became seen as a hypocritical farce because as animals, we were meant to live a dog-eat-dog, survival of the fittest lifestyle, just like the rest of the animal kingdom. So actually, this whole idea of the church morality, again, started falling more out of popularity because there was this idea of, well, that's just you trying to pretend to be something that we're not. And why should we try to do that? Why not just embrace what we are as animals? But of course, with this idea of animals as being vicious, as being cruel, as fighting all the time over resource scarcity and all kinds of other conceptions of animality that were still certainly, I would say, very speciesist. So here we have social Darwinism. Oh, that is a typo, by the way. Should be Herbert Spencer with a C. Some of these ideas of social Darwinism. Societies evolve from lower, quote unquote, barbarian to higher, quote unquote, civilized forms. Now, of course, all kinds of cultural imperialism in this one, right? Some societies are more evolved than others. And this was used to justify colonialism and imperialism because it was the more evolved members of the human race taking over because they were more fit. They were stronger, they were faster, they were smarter, and therefore they had every right to take over the weaker. Natural selection, most capable of surviving, least capable of dying out. So again, if you died, well, that's because you were weak and you weren't meant to survive. Because if you did survive, you'd be dragging down everyone else. You'd be weakening the genetic stock. And the last piece, very important, it's wrong to interfere with this process. So in other words, aid programs or anything to alleviate poverty, suffering, anything like that, you are interfering with nature. You are actually interfering with the natural order. Now, you can see, and I'm going to talk about this in the final episode, but you can see a lot of this very, very strongly still today. This has everything to do with why there's always endless money for war and there's not money for social programs. People think that that's just, oh, well, you're a hypocrite, blah, blah. But a social Darwinist would say, no, that's just the way that it's meant to be, because you put the money into the strength. If you put the money into the weakness, you're going to bring the whole society down because you're investing in weakness. Why would you do that when you could invest in strength? So pretty warped ideology, in my opinion. So we're going to continue.
Yeah, some of the Marxists started to describe capitalism as a dog-eat-dog system.
Yeah, and I would, but the whole idea of dog-eat-dog, how speciesist is that? You're basing your whole conception of capitalism on a speciesist idea about what dogs are. Yeah. So social Darwinism and eugenics were accepted. Eugenicists, I should say, accepted the premise of evolution and of all humans as animals, but saw the Western European upper class in particular as the most evolved species. So we have an image here of this disgusting image, both disgusting images, of the supposed evolution, right? So we're starting down here with primates that are more like lemurs, more tree animals with long tails, and then supposedly evolving into the ones that are closer to humans, like chimps. And then, of course, because this is racist social Darwinism, you have humans coming in, but you have Aboriginal humans, you have African humans, you have indigenous humans, and then leading up, of course, the pinnacle of evolution is the white man. You can see he's dressed like he's a member of the upper class. There's a clock there, very significant, because that was one of the defining features that this goes again back to the Enlightenment, that they thought defined the human from the non-human animal was the conception of time and clocks. And then you've got Darwin in the middle of this himself. By the way, before I continue, quick question, but very important. Does anyone here know why Africans in particular were targeted this way? Because you can probably guess why indigenous people were, right? Can anybody guess why indigenous people would be targeted this way?
I would say, if I had to guess, I don't know the answer, but if I had to guess, that white Europeans wanted to exploit that areas of the earth, so they had to devalue those individuals.
That's right. Yeah, of course, they wanted the land, right? So this would be like a Marxist analysis would say, oh, the material reality shapes the ideas. And that's exactly what it was. They wanted the land, and they had to rationalize exterminating indigenous people, displacing indigenous people. And so they animalized them and said they were lower on the evolutionary scale in order to do that. But with Africans, now, of course, people would say, well, they had to do this to Africans because they were enslaving Africans. But the big question is, out of all the world's people, why were Africans the ones that the Europeans targeted for enslavement? Does anybody know the answer to this? Because I didn't know the answer to this until actually pretty recently. And it was something that I'd been looking for my whole life. And it was a huge, huge revelation. Does anyone know?
Not really.
Yeah.
Nothing in the comments?
Yeah, nothing in the comments. So the reason why Africans were targeted specifically was because when the Europeans came to what is now called the Americas, they were primarily in the southern part of the Americas. They were in the Caribbean. They were in South America and Latin America and the southern part of what is now the United States. And they had no idea how to farm the land because it was tropical and it was so different from Europe. And so they thought, and they couldn't get the indigenous people to do it. They tried, they enslaved them too. But of course, it was their land. They were familiar with it. They had their communities and social structures. So they were much more in a position to fight back. And so what ended up happening was that the Europeans actually started writing back to Europe saying, we need Africans because Africans will know how to cultivate this land. And that was actually why Africans were targeted, was because of their knowledge. So ironically, they flipped it completely on the other upside down, but that was the original reason why they were treated so abominably and enslaved and animalized, and all the rest of it was on the basis of their knowledge that they had, that Europeans needed.
So it's interesting. There's an Irish journalist called Frank Armstrong, and he gave a talk for the VIP in 2014, I think it was, and he talked about how there was a clearance of Ireland, but for a different reason for this, in the sense that the English wanted to basically turn Ireland into a farm. So they imported so-called cattle and they had to kind of kick the humans out, and they ended up in a kind of form of slavery as well. But that's for a different reason.
Yeah, I mean, definitely everything had to do with land and resources, and then of course labor as well. But yeah, and then these ideologies were created to rationalize and justify what they were doing in order to get the material wealth that they wanted. The other picture you have, and I apologize for how horrific these images are, but you kind of have to show what was happening. So we have three images, and again, this idea of evolution. Of course, the one in the middle is the Western, the British, white male, and this is of course shown as the pinnacle of evolution. You have the African as seen as the lowest on the evolutionary scale, again for the reasons that I just said, although they would never admit that. And then in the middle you actually have, so he's not in the middle in the picture, he's on the left, but in this middle is actually an Irish man. And what's interesting is that if you read the caption, they're trying to make out that the Irish have African blood, and that's why they're genetically inferior to the British. That there were Africans who came through the Iberian Peninsula, and they racially mixed, and now the Irish are of inferior stock. What I think is important about this image is that it shows how they use proximity or this idea of likeness to lower the status of a group. So, for example, they would say, well, the Africans are more like animals, so they're lower than other humans, and the Irish are more like Africans, who are more like non-human animals, so they're lower. And they continuously use hierarchy in this way to pull other groups down. And of course, the reason why they wanted to do this to Irish people was, again, they were colonizing their land and exploiting them as workers. So they had material reasons for doing that too. So we'll continue.
Laura, there's a comment from Tori who is saying something about how they were reading that Europeans exploited African people having a higher resistance to malaria than Europeans or Native Americans as well.
Oh, yes. Right. So once there was malaria in that part of the world, right, then the Africans would have the higher resistance, so they could be pushed harder. And of course, that led to all kinds of other attitudes about, they're not as physically frail, they can work harder, and just all kinds of disgusting racist attitudes like that. But yeah, there's so many different elements to it, but that's definitely part of it. Okay, so we'll continue. Okay, so what happens is once the society adopts this idea of social Darwinism and eugenics, it takes off really at lightning speed in England and also in America. And so this was a very horrible case that happened in America in 1924. So at this stage, they're starting to become more and more convinced that they need to keep the white racial stock pure, which means a combination of factors. First of all, this is when they pass the Naturalization Act, which restricts immigration. The Natural Origin Act restricts immigration. First of all, even amongst Europeans, they wanted to keep it pure, that they didn't want too many Eastern Europeans coming in, Southern Europeans coming in. They banned Asians from coming in at this time. And then, of course, you also had mass sterilization of Black and Native people. So this was all with this idea of, we want to make sure that we maintain a white majority in order to have white supremacy, but not only that, a certain kind of white person. So, and of course, they were able to do all of this without some big legal case to Black and Native people, because They didn't have legal rights under the system anyway. But then they wanted to start doing this to white people of a certain kind. And so this was a big landmark case with a young girl named Carrie Buck. So there she is with her mother. And her mother was actually in a place that you see the picture of on the right side, which was actually, of all names, Lynchburg Colony in Virginia. And this was actually, during the eugenics era, a place where they would put people that they did not want breeding. And it was specifically white people that were otherized in some way went there. So the mother was there because they were poor. They said she was a sex worker. And, again, all of this idea of animalization is connected to sexuality, connected to lack of self-control, et cetera, et cetera. And so she was institutionalized there, and they called this place horribly ableist, I'm sorry, but they called it the Center for Epileptics and Feeble-Mindedness. And the daughter was a big landmark case because actually she was, it's a long story, but she was raped by the family that adopted her, had a young man staying there, and she was pregnant. And then the eugenicist said, well, this is a sign of her lack of moral character. This is a sign of her feeble-mindedness, et cetera, et cetera. We have to sterilize her, and we have to sterilize people like her. And they put her in that institution where they kept people to stop them from mixing and therefore sullying the racial stock of the outside society. So we can continue. And all in all, 60 to 70,000 people with uteruses were sterilized.
Did you say the place was Lynchburg or Lynchville or something?
Yeah, Lynchburg Colony.
Terrific. Yeah.
So these are some ads from the actual eugenics movement in America. So those with desired traits would be encouraged to breed as many children as possible. So this is the other side of the issue. You had the sterilizations of the undesirables, but you also had these breeding programs for those with desirable traits. So you can see here a social register of fitter families and better babies. This was a big thing in Georgia in particular, but it was all over the country. And you would have these fairs where people would come and they would show off their stock of their children, and they would be examined for their physical fitness and health and qualities that the eugenicists were looking at, racial hygiene, as they called it, and win awards and all kinds of things. So here it says science applies to human stock the same principles which have developed champion cows and horses, prize egg-laying hens, and superior pigs and sheep to lay the foundation for the proposed laws which shall someday, so we can't read this, regulate rules for human mating. Yeah. So, I mean, you can't get more of a clear case of animalization going on there, but this time amongst those with the desired traits, not the otherized people. And you've got this other one, only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics.
The use of language is really interesting, isn't it? And it just goes to show
is.
how powerful language is. And they're using terms like stock, prize, champion in terms of humans, because it's almost, and thoroughbred, things like this. And it's almost like by creating that language and animalising that language, they're again creating that hierarchy and able to enable them to get control and domination over the people and over, the reproduction of these people. So really powerful stuff, language.
So using these ideas that are familiar to people.
Yeah, there's an interesting point though, isn't there? Because as they kind of learned how to improve animal species, then, you know, I mean, this is not my view, folks, but you can see how people might go, well, we've also got to do it with humans, otherwise we're going to deteriorate. You know, we're making perfect other animals for exploitation, and whereas in the meantime, if we just let anybody breed and mate, then that means that we're going to inevitably deteriorate. And it is in a way kind of true that, you know, the human species keeps a lot of people alive, which you would assume that nature would kill. So yeah.
Right. And I mean, you know, that would be like Thomas Malthus then would come in and say, well, you know, and that's why we have overpopulation, then we're going to have resource scarcity, and that's why we have climate change. And that's when you hear people saying, oh, overpopulation. And I mean, all of this leads to very, very scary ideas. So, yeah, we'll continue.
Just while we're waiting there, Laura, I just wonder, oh, it's there now, but I was just going to ask you, I wonder if this ties in with, in society, how we tend to hide, especially we struggle to talk about, you know, mental illness because it's such a taboo subject. And also we hide illness and disease sometimes because we feel it's a weakness. And especially, and I know this is probably a little bit of a cliche, but there is that real cliche that especially in men, actually, that there's that real cliche that men are very reluctant to seek out medical help when they're struggling with something. And I wonder if it does tie into this whole sort of mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I think that we've seen a lot of this recently, in particular because of the coronavirus, right? We've had this whole idea of herd immunity. It's called herd for a reason. I mean, that's, again, harkening back to this idea of social Darwinism, only the strongest survive, eugenics, you know, this idea of get rid of the weak because they are bringing us down. I know in the UK in particular, Boris Johnson was promoting this idea of just kind of let it run its course, right? People here in the US were saying that too. There's a lot in that really does harken back to this time. And yes, absolutely, it makes people, and especially men, which is a whole other subject. I could do a whole hour-long program on that alone of how gender plays into all of this, because obviously men that's their seed, right, that they're planting, and if it's not a strong seed, you know, then it won't blossom. So I mean, there's like so much in that, and of course the man also has to be the warrior, the protector. So there's like so much layers of gender, race, class, ability, all kinds of stuff in there. So yeah, we're gonna just give a quick look at some other images from the eugenics period. You've got children being compared literally to livestock there. They would examine their bodies, you know, for specific desired traits that they were looking for. You've got J.H. Kellogg of Kellogg's, the cereal, advocated for a eugenics registry to establish racial thoroughbreds and called for sterilization of defectives. So again, very animalizing. They definitely looked at humans in animal terms, including, again, the dominant group as horses, right? Eugenics certificate. So this was for a marriage to say, oh, you know, these are two parties of good stock and they're going to produce the top quality offspring. And then you've got some images at the bottom. Now, believe it or not, there were actually eugenics displays at the World's Fairs. The first one in the 1890s, 1893, I think. And then there was another one in a very significant year, 1933 to 1934. This was going on in the US, in Chicago, while, of course, the Nazis were coming to power in Germany. So you see the eugenics health exhibit, Fitter Families for Georgia. And the families would come, again, these were the families with the desired traits, right? So the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the tall, slim physique. Yeah, Kellogg was the original founder of the plant-eating movement. I was just about to bring that up. So Kellogg actually was a Seventh-day Adventist. And yes, vegetarianism was a very big part of what he thought was the ideal diet for producing the ideal kind of human. So, yeah, a lot of stuff going on at that time. And I think we can move on.
Yeah, just a point from me, really, Gus. It's really interesting. You talk about defectives and this kind of stuff. Even in some of Reagan's speeches, you talk about the mentally enfeebled. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the R word is often used in philosophy as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole thing, is that, you have a lot of ideologies and, people that are trying to come from a liberatory stance, and yet are so programmed with this that they don't even question what the roots of it are.
It's a little bit like I mean, we've noticed that ableist language is just everywhere. You can't go on YouTube and see a talk or an exchange without ableist language.
Right.
I mean, speciesist language also, but there's even more ableist language than speciesist language.
Yeah. So here we are in Germany now. Germany becomes influenced by the US and UK, and they think, oh, very interesting what they're doing over there. And they become interested in social Darwinism and the eugenics movements that were happening, and begin implementing these ideas themselves in the Lebensborn program. This was one aspect of obviously a much, much bigger eugenicist agenda. But I want to highlight the Lebensborn program because we hardly ever hear about this. And it's very interesting to think of in terms of this whole controversy over using these Holocaust memes. And, look at the non-human animal Holocaust and then look at the human Holocaust and, see a side-by-side comparison. And obviously these memes are very controversial, but one of the arguments against using these memes is that people say it's not the same thing because during the Holocaust, they were exterminating people. And in the animal farms, they're breeding them and then killing them. It's a little more complicated than that because the Nazis did have both aspects of that, but they didn't have them in the same people. They weren't breeding people to kill them. They were killing the people that they didn't want, and then they were breeding the ones that had the traits that they did want. So they would actually go into the countries that they were invading, and they would go to the women who had the traits that they wanted, and they would bribe them. A lot of times these women were very economically distressed. This was, of course, just after World War I, and Europe was in economic crisis. It was the Depression. And so they would go in there and they would say, well, if you let the Nazis impregnate you, we will set you up with everything you need for the rest of your life. And all you have to do is let us raise your baby the way we want to raise the child. And of course, they would raise the child and indoctrinate them into the Nazi ideology. So you can see the baby carriages with the SS. You can see the woman here with rows of children in bathtubs. And they were actually also having camps where, the Nazi youth camps, they would encourage unmarried sex but of course, is all extremely heteronormative. And, it was because they wanted those children produced. So that was a big part of what they were doing, was breeding.
They'd have to do that, wouldn't they? Otherwise, they wouldn't get an offspring. You say bathtub, it looks more like a bowl of soup to me.
Yeah, they don't look like very big bathtubs. They look kind of more like, I don't know, coffee mugs or something. But or teacups.
Since you mentioned the parallels we draw in the movement, or parts of the movement today, another thing that unfortunately we hear a lot lately is that the Nazis did an experiment on other animals. And
we're about to get to that part. Yep. Although actually they did, but yes, they put a lot of restrictions on vivisection against other animals, non-human animals, I should say. So yes, we can continue.
Just sing to yourself while it comes up. There we go.
Watching
So,
my gun.
in true social Darwinian fashion, the Nazis saw everyone as different species of animals. So the Jews, the Roma, the queer people, they saw them as undesirables, vermin, basically, to be exterminated. Aryans, they saw as livestock to be bred, and disabled people as horrible as like domestic pets or domestic animals that were sickly and had to be humanely gotten rid of. And they saw themselves as predators. So you can see here horrible images. I know, I'm sorry about this, but you can see the Nazi expressed as the hawk, and then you have the Jews portrayed as rats and snakes. So again, the quote unquote vermin animals that they didn't want spreading their disease pathogens to the rest of the population and weakening them and making them sick and weakening their stock. So I think we have maybe one more slide.
There's a gendered version of this, isn't there? When you look at the sports teams that male names, kind of bears and tigers and all that kind of stuff, whereas when they apply other animal names to women, it's usually chicks and so there's a kind of a version of that. Another thing which is interesting in my research was that they tried to do this Jews are vermin type idea, but it kind of didn't work until they came up with the idea of separating this the society and creating the ghettos, because the Jew next door didn't live down to the terrible kind of stereotype that the Nazis were trying to, and so what they did was they started the ghettos, and then some diseases came into the ghetto because of the terrible conditions, and then the Nazis were saying, well, there you are, vermin, so it became a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense.
That's a really good point, because if you knew the Jew next door, then you wouldn't be able to otherize them as much.
It was a major problem for Goebbels because it just wasn't working, until they separated.
That's super
Bauman
interesting.
says that if you create physical distance, then you can more easily create moral distance. So
right, exactly.
It's logical, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is why, of course, people in the US accept the drone bombing of people in Western Asia and North Africa, because they're far away, so it doesn't affect them as much as if it was somebody that they knew personally or that was closer to home. Oh, yeah, we have a comment. The human species has employed a policy of Lebensraum, living space, yes, against wild animals whose territory has been taken for human habitation. It has been a policy of imperialist expansionism. Absolutely. That's another one of those things that, you could do a whole series on just that alone. But yes, very, very good point. So, yeah, I'm just going to quickly talk about the wolf in Nazi and fascist ideology. So we have an image of a Nazi soldier as a wolf here, and then we have the furries that have the alt-right today. This really says a lot about how the Nazis and just fascists in general view animality as it pertains to them and their ideology is they really identify with wolves. And the reason why is because actually the origins of fascism go all the way back to Napoleon colonizing the Eastern Europe. And the Eastern Europeans actually becoming very nationalistic in response to the experience of imperialism and colonialism. And they started identifying with wolves because, when the French came in, they slaughtered a lot of wolves because they saw them as predators and nuisances. And of course, as we know, because they wanted that land for livestock, ranching, farming. We all know how that goes in this movement. So they started killing the predators. And, the local people looked at that and they said, that's us symbolically, because the wolf is at the same time the predator and the victim. So they used to be strong and now they're subjugated. And that is why it's Make America Great Again, right? It's the wolf embodies those two things simultaneously. And that is really what fascism is very much about at its core.
Wow.
So we're going to take a look at the very last slide, if we have time.
It goes back to Napoleon, eh? The one on the right is saying, "Not tonight, Josephine."
Yeah. So Nazis and animal rights, the dreaded connection. I could do a whole hour on this subject alone.
Let's book her in, Roger. Let's book her in.
But I'm sure this is going to come up in the final episode, and we don't have a lot of time. So, yeah, the Nazis, basically, yes, the horrifying thing is that they did implement a platform of a lot of animal welfare policies, and nobody wants to talk about this. Nobody wants to look at this. But the big question, of course, is why? Why would they do something like this when obviously they were so monstrous when it came to humans? And there are a lot of reasons why. A lot of people think, oh, well, you know, it's for propaganda. It was basically like their version of what we would now say like vegan washing or vegetarian washing or animal rights washing. But there really was much more to it than that. That was certainly part of it. But it was also things like flattening out the difference in valuation between humans and non-human animals so that there wasn't this automatic assumption of, well, we have to have human rights because, well, maybe human rights threaten animal rights. They really put those two ideas at odds with each other. And I hate to say this, but we see a lot of this in the animal rights movement today, right? This idea of, well, you know, if we stand up for the rights of those humans, then animals will suffer. So there was a lot of that going on in that ideology. And it's very interesting because for anybody who's been watching this series since the very beginning, you might remember that I brought up the story of Cain and Abel, and that the Bible was actually trying to warn people about this very thing. They were saying, well, if you take away that binary, then all hell will break loose because then human life won't have any more value than that of a beetle, right? So you can do anything you want to a human and there will be no sense of human rights because that boundary won't be there. And the Nazis basically exploited that. And it's very interesting because actually one of the big inspirations of the Nazis, which was the composer Wagner, actually spoke about Cain and Abel and said, well, this is an example of why the Jews are so morally corrupt, because they push an agenda of human supremacy. And of course, Christians by extension, because Christianity came out of Judaism. Jesus was originally Jewish. So actually they opposed that. And that really has a lot to do with, again, you know, this idea of Christians kind of fearing the removal of this boundary. So I know we're running out of time. We can talk a little bit more about this. Yeah.
Could you maybe
so
just
Rama,
do a
yeah.
quick summary about that one again?
Mm-hmm. So Rama said, can you talk, why were they interested in animal welfare? Well, they were interested for a lot of reasons. And, you know, I would need a lot of time to talk specifically about this, but basically they did take away that idea of there being that boundary between humans and non-human animals. And in doing so, they could then justify doing these heinous things to the humans that they wanted to persecute, because why should we use? So, for example, here I'll give an example. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, why should we use non-human animals for vivisection when we could use rapists or murderers or pedophiles? The Nazis would say things like that about Jews. Why should we use non-human animals when we could use Jews? And look at what Jews have done to us all through the centuries, and basically kind of divorced us from our natural way of life. They blamed Jews for what they saw as the wrong turn in human history. And interestingly, this goes kind of back to what I was talking about at the beginning with the Romantic era versus the Enlightenment era, because the Nazis were this strange hybrid of the ideas of both. And they really romanticized this idea of nature and animals. That's where blood and soil comes from. This idea of the German that's been corrupted by the civilizing influence of the Jew. This idea of the German returning to their roots. That's why they were also very interested in pre-Christian religions and all that sort of thing. And just this idea of we want to reconnect with our animal nature. We want to reconnect with our animal nature. We're not trying to avoid it, but we actually see that as, sorry about my phone going off.
Oh, don't worry.
I think I just hit the go now. Go off.
Laura,
Yeah.
Oh, that's your phone. I wonder, does this tie in? I was thinking about this when I was kind of looking through the slides and stuff. Does this tie in with something that Patrice Jones talks about in The Oxen at the Intersection, which is that concept of innocence as part of constructing an identity? So she talks about white identity, but I guess we could relate that to a supremacist or oppressor identity, in that innocence equals goodness and then makes you entitled to privileges, but you have to maintain innocence in order to maintain the privileges, and you're having to distance yourself away from the harms on which they depend. So maybe is this this kind of advocating for other animals and their welfare a way of kind of constructing part of that innocence in order to distance themselves from the harms that they're doing to human animals? And because innocence is deeply linked to exceptionalism, I believe, and entitlement due to goodness. So it's that construction of that whole supremacist oppressor identity.
So I would definitely agree with that. But I would say with the fascists, it went a little further than that as well, because they saw animal nature as having a kind of innocence. So in other words, even if their actions might seem cruel or barbaric, they would say that there was an innocence in that because it was pure and it was unadulterated and it was not corrupted by the civilizing influence. So that's the weird thing about them is, yeah.
So it was the natural thing to do. That was the main argument there.
Yeah. And I mean, you could also kind of look at this in psychoanalytic terms, that it would be like the id without the corrupting influence of the ego, right? The id is just allowed to be unleashed. And it's like a baby. It doesn't think about the consequences. And in that is its innocence. So it's a very strange way of looking at it. But yeah, but yes, there's definitely a concept of that, of the corrupt. I won't even say, I mean, certainly Jew was a big part of it, but the corrupt sort of like metropolitan, cosmopolitan person versus the innocent animal or the innocent person that, was just like, and that had a lot to do with why they were kind of anti-education as well, because it was this whole idea of that corrupts your innocence.
Would you say that the idea of protecting one's territory, the way other animals do, plays into that? Because I was thinking that today we still hear a lot, unfortunately it's very prominent, the idea of maintaining the purity of a race in nationalistic terms, and using this idea to oppress others, in the case of Europe today, refugees, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely say that, I mean, all of this is like such a throwback to the original Nazis and the eugenics and the social Darwinism, that in order to understand what is going on now, we really have to look at what was going on then. And I also feel like there's just such a huge piece of it that relates to animals and animality and nature, that our movement has something extremely important to say about this if we can look at that in that way and respond to that in that way.
I don't know if we have time. Oh, sorry, Roger. I was only just going to ask time because Jeremy's brought this up, and I wanted to bring this up. And Laura, I know we spoke about this before, but Jeremy asked the question: how does this tie into using animal Holocaust language? And I know Laura, that's something that you, I'm sure, have a view on. That I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on that, because obviously that's been a big topic in the movement recently.
Right, exactly. So I'm going to start off by telling everyone that's watching that I'm Jewish, for those of you who don't know. So I am coming from that perspective. My feeling on this is that it's very interesting, because I think the way that those analogies are being made is extremely damaging. It's very thoughtless. It's very careless. It knows nothing about the actual history behind any of this. And it's just being used for like shock value. And it's harmful. And it's actually reinforcing, it could actually reinforce speciesism, believe it or not, and also, of course, anti-Semitism. So I don't think that's effective. And I also find it very interesting that some of the people who've been using those analogies are using a term called subhuman, as a kind of an insult for anybody who objects to that. That's very interesting, because the Nazis actually used that term, and it meant not only less than human, but less than other animals. So that even has a Nazi connection to it and a history behind it. But the other thing I'm going to say is that if we can respond to the connection between the Holocaust and animalization in a way that really understands the history behind this, I actually think we have something profoundly important to say as a movement. I don't know if anybody out here, or if any of the panelists have read the book Eternal Treblinka by Charles Patterson, but he talks about how the slaughterhouses were either modeled after factory farms and slaughterhouses. I'm sorry, Freudian slip. The concentration camps were modeled on, or they were actual repurposed slaughterhouses. The cattle cars, of course, were called cattle cars because they were literal cattle cars before they were used to transport Holocaust victims. And the entire system of industrialized slaughter came from the industrialization of non-human animal slaughter. So, there's something, I mean, by the time I had finished that book, I was actually really convinced that if they had not systematized non-human animal slaughter, maybe the Holocaust never would have actually happened. It's a very big thing to say, but that was my honest opinion on it. So I think we have a lot to say about this as a movement, but we're really shooting our own cause in the foot by making these sorts of analogies in such an insensitive and offensive and careless way.
You said that the Nazis removed the divide between humans and other animals, right? But weren't they actually just trying to create another one between humans in general and other animals and Aryans?
Absolutely. So the thing about this is that they saw Aryans as animals as well, which is really, that's why I was talking about kind of, them sort of having this idea of embracing their animal nature as predators. But yes, absolutely.
So they were the wolves and everyone else was the sheep, I suppose.
Right. Well, it was like they were the wolves, and then everybody else was either the sheep, or they were the rats, or they were the, injured animal that just was sick and they had to get rid of them, or, but they absolutely did have many dividing lines. And that was the biggest one within this conception of humans as animals. So, my big point here is that the real underlying issue is you have to undo all forms of hierarchy, and you have to approach them all at once, because if you approach them in isolation, this is the mess that you can end up with.
So it's not only about removing the divide between humans and other animals.
Right.
It's about how you're going to do that. And definitely that if you're going to do that, which of course we want to do, you need to be aware of all the oppressions that are taking place right now, and make sure that this is liberatory for everyone.
Yes. And that's why I titled the last episode, you remove that divide. Is it total liberation or is it total annihilation? Because that's what we're dealing with. That's how powerful this is. that it could go one way or the other, and they're both very extreme.
So what we need to do really is change the power hierarchies and the logic of domination in society. That's at the root of all of it, really, isn't it?
Right.
As opposed to just picking off the different oppressions that we relate most to.
Absolutely, yes.
That whole structure in the systems.
That's totally what I've come to believe. Absolutely, yes.
So Laura, what are you? We're taking a little break from this series, but in the final episode, what are you going to be presenting us with?
So
give us a taster.
Okay. So in the final episode, I'm going to be talking about the situation as it stands now. So now that we kind of have this foundation of historical understanding to work off of, we're going to be looking at, first of all, social Darwinism in neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is the dominant ideology today, and social Darwinism plays a very big role in it. We'll actually find out that the founder of neoliberalism was very, very influenced by social Darwinism, growing up in Austria at the turn of the century. So he kind of implemented those ideas to provide the foundation for neoliberalism. And we're also going to be looking at, of course, modern day fascism and the alt-right, and, you know, how this ideology of animalization is still playing a role in that today to justify hierarchy and systems of domination. We're going to be looking at this issue that I'm talking about with the animal rights movement, how the single issuism can actually lead in that very dangerous direction. But we're also going to talk about the issue of the left not wanting to incorporate the animal and nature analysis into their approach to resisting injustice and oppression, and how that is weakening them as well, and how actually in doing so, what we've actually done is we've allowed the right to co-opt the whole conception of animality and nature, and what that tells us about our nature of humans as humans and what human society should look like. So I'm going to be talking about all of that, and then I'm going to be finally talking about some actual directions that we might be able to take as a movement to kind of reclaim that idea of animals and nature. What is their true nature? And what does that tell us about human nature and how we should be with each other and with them moving forward? And basically this idea that if we can actually take control of that narrative, we can shape the whole world.
Oh, look forward to that one. I'm going to sort it all out.
We'll put the world to rights. Of course, we've got to be careful about the way that the right are moving into our movement. You know, perhaps we don't need to give them the oxygen of publicity, for one thing. So we're going to say thank you. It's we're 23 minutes over, but it's been absolutely fascinating series. For those, if you go to my YouTube channel, you can see the entire series there. Or if you go to the Facebook page, Animal Rights Show, you can see there's links there too. So people will be able to sit down there with their popcorn and watch the entire series. And
can I just say as well
that
part 4 coming up. Sorry, Wendy.
No, sorry, I didn't realise you haven't finished, Roger. Sorry. I was just going to say that the comments that coming into have been absolutely brilliant. I've really enjoyed reading the comments. It's a shame we couldn't bring up every single one, because there's been some amazing interaction, feedback, comments, insights from people. So thank you to everyone who's been commenting, and thanks for being here as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, to everyone who's watching, and thank you so much for having me, to my fellow panelists here.
Laura.
So be good, everyone, and we'll see you again. Well, probably next week, I would say.
And if you can't be good, be careful.
Oh, yeah. That's what they used to say, isn't it?
Definitely.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone.